policy connects, or maybe doesn't, to broader patterns of institutional control.
Exactly. So the central question we're sort of grappling with based on the material is this. Does this modern move to restrict communication, like the phone bans, represent a significant new tactical step? Is it about isolating students, creating vulnerability, especially in a crisis?
Or, and this is where I lean, is it fundamentally just, well, piling onto a control architecture that's already deeply embedded in the public education system's history? Is it just turning up the volume on something old?
Okay, so let's lay out our positions. I'll argue that these phone restrictions are actually a crucial, very modern tactical move. They seem specifically designed to create an immediate condition of, vulnerability, helplessness, really, especially given the context of increasing state power.
And I'll be arguing, well, maybe from a slightly different angle. While I agree, the cell phone ban is concerning, maybe even exploitative, I think the core architecture of control is much older. It stems from the historical foundations of the education system itself, which, was arguably engineered to instill obedience and dampen critical thought. So the phone limits, while powerful, are essentially a secondary lever acting on a population already primed for compliance.
All right, let me expand on my perspective then. Why I see this communication ban as more than just, classroom management. Why it feels like a tactical nexus of control, really vital to modern forms of authority. The policy, I believe, intentionally creates what the source material calls the trapped condition.
Okay.
This means the student is physically isolated, cut off, made powerless in a very immediate way. And that's a huge vulnerability, particularly when you consider how state power operates today, increasingly militarized, often unaccountable. This action, it effectively removes the immediate agency that a child might otherwise have in a crisis. I mean, think about the specific scenario that parents rightly fear. A child being completely unable to contact a parent if, let's say, masked federal agents or ICE agents, whose budgets, we should note, have significantly increased, were to enter a school. That sudden lack of communication capability ensures the individual is rendered, and the material uses these exact words, helpless and trapped.
And that's not theoretical, right?
No, not at all. We've seen reports referenced about ICE agents literally stationed outside public schools arresting students. It transforms schools from supposed safe zones into, well, places of genuine fear. And crucially, the mechanism of control here is the centralization of information flow. The institution insists, just call the school instead. But that directive transfers the vital power of communication away from the decentralized unit, the child and parent, and puts it squarely in the hands of the school administration. That, to me, feels like a foundational requirement for controlling the narrative during any kind of crisis.
That's certainly a compelling case, especially drawing on those quite frightening contemporary realities. But I would argue that the effectiveness of that tactic hinges on something deeper, a vulnerability that's been cultivated historically. The population, including students, is already highly susceptible because the public education system itself was, well, deliberately engineered for mass compliance right from the start. This history, I think, renders the external threat, or the inability to communicate externally, less critical than the internal conditioning that's already taken place.
So you're going back to the origins.
Exactly. We really have to look at the American public education system's roots, particularly its borrowing from the 19th century Prussian model. Now, this model wasn't designed to foster critical thinking. It was explicitly built to instill duty, discipline, respect for authority, and the ability to follow orders. The stated goals cited right there in the material was even starker: to destroy free will.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, you have philosophers like Johann Gottlieb Fichte,
Whose ambition for this kind of schooling was incredibly clear. He wanted to make pupils, and this is a quote, incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. This deep, long-term historical conditioning is what creates what, psychologists later termed learned helplessness.
Okay.
When individuals are systematically denied agency, denied meaningful critical engagement from childhood onwards, they tend to cease effort.
They stop engaging after repeated experiences where they feel they have no control. So the system, quite successfully in many ways, manages to squeeze out all independent thinking from the masses. This ensures they are inherently compliant, often regardless of whether they have a cell phone in their pocket or not. The ideological framework, the conditioning, that's the primary control mechanism, in my view.
I see why you emphasize the long-term conditioning, the learned helplessness. It's a powerful historical argument. But let me offer maybe a different perspective on the nature of the vulnerability we're seeing right now in this climate. Learned helplessness. Okay, that describes a mental state, right? Passive compliance. But the phone ban, I think, creates something different, a physical and temporal vulnerability. It's immediate, and it feels strategically useful against modern, often aggressive state power.
Physical and temporal. How so?
Well, when we talk about the potential deployment of armed troops or masked federal agents, or the steady erosion of due process, especially with agencies like ICE becoming more active in communities, the physical isolation created by a phone ban supports an immediate, unprecedented risk. The kind of state aggression you mentioned, it's not just an abstract concept, it's a rapidly deployable reality. So, by isolating children from outside communication, from being able to document what's happening, the policy actively enables an institutional mechanism. It can transform a political conflict, like a raid or an incursion, into an immediate personal danger that potentially can't be recorded, can't be shared, can't be countered externally in real time. The tactical immediacy of the ban, that ability to control the narrative in the first crucial hour of a crisis, that's what makes it so vital in the modern authoritarian playbook, as I see it.
That's an interesting point about the tactical immediacy. But I might frame its success a bit differently. I'd say the modern policy works so effectively precisely because the system has already done the heavy lifting of cultivating compliance. It has, as the material suggests, already removed the power of most people to make sense out of the available information. I mean, think about it. Is a physically trapped individual who still retains critical thought and internal agency truly more vulnerable in the long run than a compliant individual? Someone who's been, and again, citing the material, bred from birth to respect authority above all else and accept it without question. If a child's mind is already conditioned to believe that the authority figures, teachers, administrators, even uniformed agents are inherently acting in their best interest, then the urgent need for an external call diminishes, doesn't it? The policy of limiting phones from this perspective is just capitalizing on that pre-existing philosophical design that promotes conformity, the quietness, the stillness, the ingrained willingness to follow orders that's been instilled over decades, even centuries.
But doesn't that overlook the role of the phone as a tool against that conditioning, especially now?
Well, I'd argue the primary control method remains ideological indoctrination and curriculum control. The system is still day in and day out pushing specific worldviews. It's still stigmatizing mistakes in a way that tends to educate people out of their creative capacities. The real danger, perhaps, isn't the lack of a phone call in a specific moment, but the resulting susceptibility later on to things like propaganda online or those manipulative efforts that says violence is the solution. This susceptibility arises directly from that lack of critical thinking fostered by the system. So restricting physical communication feels like a relatively simple measure that leverages the successful suppression of independent thought achieved over, say, 12 years of schooling.
See, I'm not fully convinced by that line of reasoning, because for a young person today, the phone is often the only practical means they have for decentralized resistance, for rapidly distributing a counter-narrative. In our current context, with algorithmic control and information gatekeeping, centralized systems genuinely fear what the material refers to as distributed resistance, sometimes called the Hydra strategy, Explain that a bit more, the Hydra strategy connection.
Right. What I mean is this. When a state or maybe a powerful corporation tries to suppress a story or an event, if one person manages to record it, share it, and then hundreds or thousands of others can share replicable methods for resistance or documentation, the suppression attempt often fails. It spreads too fast. So by eliminating personal communication devices within the physical confines of the school, the system effectively cuts off the primary channel for this kind of asymmetrical warfare against official narratives, against corporate gatekeepers, against state actors. This blockage ensures the institution, the state, maintains much tighter control over the flow of information, especially during an emergency. The school administration basically controls the reality of a crisis within its walls because the main tool for decentralized recording and communication has been confiscated.
Okay, so that centralization of information, that leads directly to what you see as the core institutional logic behind the ban.
Exactly. The policy deliberately forces parents to rely solely on the institution. It centralizes the information flow during any kind of event, critical or otherwise, and this aligns perfectly with the concept that's discussed in the material, the idea of the governmental Ouroboros model.
The snake eating its tail?
Precisely. A self-referential, operationally closed political system. Its basic operating code is simply power, non-power. By banning personal phones, the system translates every external issue, whether it's a genuine crisis, a safety concern, or just parental anxiety, into a question of who holds the power to act and communicate. And the answer this policy enforces is always the school, the institution, never the decentralized parent or child. It's fundamentally about operational closure and asserting sole authority.
But isn't that idea, the state essentially replacing the parent, isn't that also deeply historical? It runs far deeper than just digital tech or crisis management, surely. I mean, historically, this goal was explicitly political and philosophical. You look at figures like Horace Mann, one of the foundational architects of American public education, he actively promoted the concept that, and I quote, "the state is the father of children."
Yeah.
So the modern ban, couldn't it just be seen as a continuation, a modern manifestation of this fundamental logic within the political system, a logic that consistently positions the state as the ultimate authority over a child's development, their mind, their welfare?
That's a fair point about the lineage of the idea.
And furthermore, we have to look at this in context with parallel actions, right? The systematic attacks on public education. We've seen the gutting of funding, the elimination of arts or civics programs. Doesn't this serve a larger strategic plan? A plan aimed at breaking public trust, making citizens feel like nothing works? This deliberate cultivation of failure, this political leveraging of the education system's vulnerabilities, that feels like the true root of control. The phone ban, in this light, looks more like a symptom, an opportunistic measure that takes advantage of the system's structural decay rather than being some revolutionary new tactic in itself.
So wrapping up my position, while I absolutely acknowledge the critical importance of that historical foundation of obedience you've outlined, I still maintain that the modern prohibition of mobile communication acts as a crucial contemporary vulnerability multiplier. It strategically isolates students from outside support precisely during periods of heightened authoritarian risk, things like federal overreach or the deployment of unaccountable agents. This isolation makes them immediately powerless in a crisis, and that immediate powerlessness is, I argue, a tactically essential requirement for systemic control to function effectively in our modern environment, which is characterized by centralized information control and, at times, militarized enforcement.
And to summarize my view, while the communication ban is without doubt deeply concerning and clearly exploits existing conditions quite ruthlessly, I see it as primarily capitalizing on those structurally designed pre-existing vulnerabilities. The foundational control for me still lies in that centuries-old intent of public education to instill obedience, to foster learned helplessness. This ensures that when the state does decide to act, whether it's through ideological means, systemic neglect, or even physical incursions like the ones you mentioned, the populace it encounters is already conditioned. They're already less likely to question, less likely to dissent effectively because the groundwork was laid long ago.
It's clear, I think, that the architecture of control we're discussing is complex. It seems to operate on both levels, the historical foundational design of the education system itself, and these very contemporary tactical restrictions on individual communication and agency.
Indeed. And it highlights the necessity of examining this material, these policies, through both of those critical lenses. We need to consider the strategic push for immediate vulnerability and the deep-seated structural foundation of compliance to really grasp the pervasive nature of the system we're analyzing.